podcast is part of the Sports Social Podcast Network.
Welcome along to Humans of Speedway. I'm Ian Brannan. It's great to be back with you once again. If you're a new listener to this podcast series, well, first of all, a huge welcome and thank you. And secondly, make sure you hit the subscribe or follow button, depending on what app you're listening to, so you don't miss any of the upcoming episodes, because there are a few on the way. So, in this episode, I'm really happy to bring it to you because my next guest is part of one of the most well-known Speedway families, despite none of them having ever really ridden a Speedway bike in anger, if ever. Phil Lanning is a multi-award-winning journalist and sports publicist, and during his career, he's written for the Sun newspaper for over 25 years, as well as writing leading articles for the Speedway Star, and working directly alongside names such as Tai Woffinden, Jason Crump and Gary Havelock in managing their PR and publicity coverage. He's also the youngest son of legendary commentator Dave Lanning, a voice that the majority of Speedway fans will have either grown up with or be aware of. And so it's little surprise that Phil continues his dad's work reporting on and promoting the sports of not just Speedway, but also darts. We'll also get to know a little more about what it was like growing up in a family so dedicated to Speedway and surrounded by well-known names, from watching racing on Neil Middleditch's shoulders to Bruce Penhall lending his jacket. We'll also look at how tough it is for Speedway to make an impression in the national press, and we'll look at how today's young riders can help make themselves stars. Plus, Phil will also be describing his own dream Speedway meeting before the end too. But it's my great pleasure to welcome to Humans of Speedway, Phil Lanning.
Good afternoon.
Usually I start these things off by saying, how did you find your way into Speedway, or what's your earliest memory of picking up a bike, or who introduced you to it? But in your case, it's a bit of a no-brainer. When your dad was the commentator on, one of the biggest TV shows in the country, World of Sport, just out of comparison, used to get more viewers then than, say, Strictly Come Dancing gets now. That's how big it was, and Speedway was a huge part of that. But what are your earliest memories of Speedway in your family?
Yeah, when I grew up, my dad was on World of Sport, as you said, and a lot of the time, the most I saw of my dad during the week was on a Saturday afternoon when he was on the television screen, which is a bit curious growing up. And World of Sport had a 13 million audience at the time, so and that was sort of a complete. You're talking about something like about a 50% share of the audience for grandstand on a Saturday afternoon, primetime TV for sport. So he was, when I was going to school, it was, everyone knew who my dad was, and sort of, I got a fair bit of stick for that, but as you do, but in some, not in this terms of, when I say stick, it was like teasing and stuff like that. So, but I know they were really halcyon days for me. I remember them with great fondness. And my dad was a massive inspiration, and still is to this day, and will always be my biggest inspiration. My dad and my mum. My mum was my mum was the driving force as well. My dad was the sort of figurehead, but my mum was the one who put the rocket up your backside and made sure you were motivated. And no, it was a great time. I mean, my earliest recollection of Speedway is not so much my dad on television. My personal recollection is Eastbourne. My earliest recollection of life is actually being on Neil Middleditch's shoulders, and his big bundle of red hair when he had long hair. Like, he looked like some member of the glam rock group Sweet. And walking, I remember being at Eastbourne. He was my first. Neil was my hero, and I would be about, I think that was about 1974 at Eastbourne. He would have been about 17, something like that. But that was the Kamikaze Kids that my dad created down there. They were the all-conquering Kamikaze Kids at Eastbourne, and the Dugard family in East. But Arlington was my first love. Eastbourne was my first love of Speedway. But there was times we went to World Finals, and I went to my first World. Well, I went to my first meeting of it. I obviously don't remember. I was 6 weeks old at Wembley in I think it was late or early September 1970. So, but no, so they were honestly, I think of them with great fondness. We went through lots of different eras as a family because my dad was on television, but he also ran different tracks. I mean, there was obviously West Ham, Romford, and before I was around, and then like my brother and sister will recollect Romford and West Ham with great fondness. I wasn't around then, but then Eastbourne was my era, and then Reading in 1980, and then my brother was at Poole in the early 80s, and then Eastbourne in the mid 80s, and then Wimbledon. So our best days as a family were sort of Eastbourne, and then we used to go to Wimbledon on a Thursday night as a family. We used to go and have something to eat there and watch the meeting. So it's also got great fondness as well. So great that that was my childhood was Speedway, and it's something I look back on with great affection.
And as you touched on there, not only was he a commentator, and a very good one, and part of British life around that time, of course, but he was also a promoter as well, and somebody who'd managed Speedway clubs, and so had this real deep understanding of what went into the sport.
I think my dad was, although he first went to Speedway when he was 10 years old, at the first meeting ever at Poole in 1948, and that his love of the sport started there. But he always kept Speedway as a sort of at arm's length. He sort of had a full-time job. He was a very high up executive at TV Times magazine during its, again, really sort of big days with TV Times when they were selling millions of copies, and he was a showbiz and celebrity reporter. That's why he first came to London from Bournemouth. So he was outside of the sport, but I think he kept Speedway at arm's length with involvement as much as he could, but he loved the flamboyant side of it. He wanted to promote the sport. He loved the sport and had an ideal of how it should be, how it should come across, because it was an exciting sport. And he grew up in the days when it was huge. It was getting massive crowds, and then it started to dwindle. But he still had the same ideals of how showmen should be. These were the days when there was proper old style promoters who properly did promote the sort of the Johnny Hoskins, the Len Silvers, these guys who really knew what they were trying to attract crowds, and they would get rivalries going. And he loved all that. I mean, my dad he loved getting stuck in and having a bit of, we call it banter now, but it was a lot of the time it was needle. It was always, he used to be very, very clever at sort of creating rivalries and tensions and feuds and vendettas. And it was all sort of shake hands at the end of the night and have a smile and go, that was a great crowd we got there tonight. But beforehand, it was a little bit sort of along the way of how Eddie Hearn would handle boxing now. It was all sort of, what boxers are like before a fight. They hate each other's guts and they're trying to fight each other at press conferences. And then at the end of it, when they've beaten each other to a pulp, they go and shake hands and cuddle each other and say, we love you. It was a bit like that sort of idea of promotion. And I think that's what my dad always wanted. He wanted to promote Speedway, and because he was on television and because he had to make sure that Speedway came. I mean, at the end of the day, the thing that people don't see is that he was a real groundbreaker and trailblazer for darts and Speedway, because he put them first. He was the one who pushed to get them on television on prime time. That was his baby, and if that was his responsibility, he had to make sure that those executives at London Weekend Television and all those different regions around the country, that they were getting something exciting. It had to live with, remember, it was in amongst things like wrestling and we're funny if it was being in the headlines this week, like Eddie Kidd and Evel Knievel doing, that's what World of Sport covered. They covered sort of non-traditional sports in contrast to grandstand. So that meant that Speedway had to really sell itself, which is where during that time it was very helpful, because it had Michael Lee, Bruce Penhall, Kenny Carter were knocking lumps out of each other or controversial. So, and he was doing it for the Sun newspaper as well. So all of these things meant that Speedway had to be exciting and glamorous and controversial. And that's what he thrived on, and that's what really fired him up.
Last lap, and Carter has again moved up, and Carter's trying the inside run on the grass there. That might be worth having a look at, because it looked like Kenny Carter went across the inside line as they go into the bottom corner, and Carter throwing everything in. Penhall holding on as they come over the line. It's going to be a close call, and it's just Penhall.
And so things like when he did go to another track, I mean, when he went to Eastbourne, he created the Kamikaze Kids. And when he went to Reading, it was like the £50,000 bonus if they were, which was a lot of money in 1980, and that's what he wanted to do. He wanted to create interest and real sort of. He just wanted to be kind of Speedway wanted to be sexy as far as he was concerned. That people wanted to talk about it. So that's what drove him. I don't think he was too bothered about the ins and outs and dealings with riders and trying to sort out who paid for the tyres and the methanol and all that. He enjoyed the side of it where he could promote these guys into superstars. If you ask people like John Davis, and John Davis was a very good rider for a long period of time, but he elevated John into a different stratosphere because he made John the glamour boy of British Speedway. And he was on the front cover of TV Times once, which had sort of 5 million readership at the time, or even more. And he was on page 7. He was a page 7 fella of the Sun newspaper, and so that's what motivated him more than anything. Not so much the nuts and bolts. He usually ended up being a sort of promoter / publicist more than anything, which is pretty much what I'm like to a lot of people to a certain extent.
And I think as well, rather than just calling what was going on the track, he helped and had this knack of telling a story of the meeting, the stuff that was beyond what was going on in that minute once the tapes went up and they went round 4 times. He was very good at really telling that story and dropping that extra, odd bit of info in here and there, and really seizing on those little snippets that were going on in front of us that perhaps the fans weren't aware of.
What also goes on in the background is that he would seize upon a situation. We could be sitting at home around the dining room table on a Thursday night, and we'd find out that Penhall and Carter have had a rammy in a 16 lapper at Ipswich or something like that, and suddenly, but again, this is where his passion for the sport. He would then ring straight away. He would ring an executive from London Weekend Television saying, "We've got to get this on. We've got to get an interview with Carter or Penhall on." And then he had a great friendship with Gary Newbon, who was based in the Midlands, which is obviously Central TV was where Penhall was with Cradley. And so my dad would be on the phone to Gary Newbon at late hours saying, right, we've got to get hold of him tomorrow. We'll get him in the studio, get him on World of Sport. And he would be driving that agenda for Speedway.
Well, there's an agitated Kenny Carter who clearly is unhappy, and we know this young man from the past is not short of a word or two. We've got Gary Newbon down there with him.
Well, Kenny, we can show you a playback of that. How did you see it?
If you watch in a minute, I touched the tapes. And look at Deli Cigaros now, he just put his hand up. Look at that. And how can he exclude me for that?
The way it all worked out, the dynamic of Penhall and Carter and Lee and these guys, and then you throw in Gary Newbon, who was brilliant as well. And Gary Newbon never shied out of a difficult question. I don't think we see that really much anymore in Speedway, where when things do go pear-shaped, that you're brave enough to go in and say, did he knock you off, or is that fair?
Well, Michael Lee, the world champion, clearly unhappy about that decision.
Michael, what's the outcome? Have you been excluded?
Oh, I don't know. It's so ridiculous. Even Kevin's admitting, I hadn't touched him. We just went in the corner for a hard race, and what happens? You get excluded. If you can't race in Speedway these days, what's the point in doing it?
Let's take you back and show it to you, Michael. Here you go.
Yeah, well, we've gone out a picture there, but Kevin had moved off the line about 2 yards, and there's just enough of a gap there for me, right? See, Kevin straightened up on his own. There you go. Kevin had gone by the corner anyway.
My God.
He's out. He was on his own. That's nothing to do with me.
So you're thinking you shouldn't be? You're saying you shouldn't be in these? Yeah, but can I just ask you? You're in the rerun. He's back in the re-race now. Well, there you go, Dave Lanning. He's back in the race again.
Well, we really do have some fun in games.
The whole thing, the way the whole dynamic worked during that period of time it just fitted, and Speedway benefited greatly from it. And sadly, when Bruce quit, and then obviously that lost that rival with Kenny, and the Danes came in. The Danes weren't really up for that sort of controversy. They were far too professional and squeaky clean and far too good, and they absolutely murdered England at every turn. And it's sort of that. And then obviously Speedway lost World of Sport in '85, which again that was part of the driving agenda, and got Speedway Sports Desk didn't see Speedway anymore, so that's where it dwindled away.
So he was the voice of the Speedway commentary, of course, on World of Sport. And in his more recent times, people might know Dave Lanning as a name as being a commentator on the darts on Sky Sports, of course. But there was another career that maybe went under the radar in some parts of the country. But in the north, a long-running TV series was The Indoor League, which was all about pub sports. Anything from shove halfpenny to table football, a game called Cheese Skittles. This was like primetime stuff in the north. And your dad was commentator for the darts on there. It was all hosted by Fred Truman from Yorkshire Cricket Club, puffing on a pipe.
Today we're going to concentrate on the birds of a feather, ladies' darts, markswomen who wouldn't have let down Henry V at Agincourt. Here's Brenda Simpson of Dronfield near Sheffield.
Yeah, I mean, I never realised when I was growing up. My dad was never at home midweek. He obviously worked full time for TV Times, and then he wouldn't come back home on a Tuesday and Wednesday. And I never, all these years, and all I knew that he'd gone to Leeds, and I didn't know what this was, and so it wasn't until I'd never seen Indoor League. I'd heard about it, never really seen it. I'd missed that sort of boat because it was on Yorkshire television. It wasn't ever shared. But there was a key thing about that, is that that's where he met Sid Waddell, because Sid Waddell was the producer of, and that's where that relationship formed, and they were best, and that's what put darts basically on mainstream television, was Indoor League, because those two got together. My dad had done darts, had been the first one to do darts in 1972 at the Ali Pali, the old News of the World tournament, and then they got a massive audience for it, and then suddenly a producer, Peter Jones, was a producer in Yorkshire. He had this idea to do Indoor League, and then Peter Jones took that. Eventually, darts went on to mainstream national television instead of just regional. So I hadn't seen Indoor League until I was sitting in a friend's house in Glasgow in 1998, watching Fantasy Football League with Baddiel and Skinner for the 1998 World Cup. I'm sitting watching, and I absolutely love Frank Skinner. He just has something about him. He makes me laugh a lot. And I'm sitting there watching this with my actual workmates at the Sun. And suddenly they said, "Have you seen this clip from this bloke in the mid-70s? This is this brilliant clip we found on the archives from this show. Listen to this bloke, Dave Lanning." And I'm looking up at the television going, "What?" And it was suddenly this clip of, as you rightly said, it was like this woman Muriel from Bradford hitting their first 180.
Brenda Simpson, her opponent from Sheffield. Many championships this lady has won over the years. 40 score. One feels that the dry sherries are taking their toll on the Ladies' Darts Championship.
I mean, I absolutely roasted my dad about it. We just ringing him up saying, "What the hell? You spent all my childhood in Leeds for this rubbish you did." But the Indoor League actually ended up being, I think they did something like about 12 series, about 70 odd shows, which was remarkable. But that was what actually, that show was where darts was born on the BBC, because Sid left Yorkshire and my dad got him the job. BBC needed a commentator and he lined Sid up with the job of the BBC, and they ended up as rivals. And then for years and years, and then they went, in their latter days, they then went on to Sky together. And ironically, because there's an actual placard on Yorkshire television where Indoor League, they put Giles Smith from the Times did a story and saying how darts was born there at this studio. And my dad and Sid used to my dad used to turn up on the train in Leeds and walk with Sid and then do a pub crawl and get to the studio and then spend the night there, and then so that's where darts was born. And then ironically, when they went to unveil the plaque in I can't remember the year, it was about 2010, I can't remember the exact year, it was thick snow, and Giles asked them to do this picture shoot with him there, and my dad got to the train station, but they had no taxis because the snow was so bad. So he ended up meeting Sid, and they did the same walk from the train station to the studio, where they always used to do, and they did the picture, and that was that. But they never saw each other again. So because Sid died of cancer, and they never did it. So the next time we did that walk, I met my dad at the train station, and we walked the same walk to the studio and then on to the funeral for Sid's funeral. So that was, but that's where, so indoor league, although it was comical, it was a sign of the times, but it also launched this monster that is darts on television, because my dad and Sid turned out to be such of these powerhouses, which made the sport what it is today. To a certain extent, obviously, the Phil Taylors and the Bristows and the Jockey Wilsons obviously made the sport what it is. So, but that it was all born in that studio from that god awful indoor league has got a lot to be responsible for.
It's funny how things turn out, isn't it? Let's move on to your story now, though, because it's important we talk about your dad, because clearly a massive figure within Speedway, but also a huge influence in you and your direction, because you have very much followed in his footsteps. And was that a natural thing? Was it always going to be that way, that you would continue this family tradition, being involved in Speedway and darts, and your own career as a journalist really forming around those sports?
I don't think there was ever a thought in my mind at any stage that I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing. That was my right from day one. I can never remember. All I remember doing is wanting to get. I remember Mum and Dad buying me a typewriter. I remember wanting to sit. I had a desk next to my dad's in his office at home, and where I would just sit and do that and type away and create little magazines and things, and that was just there was never a doubt that I wanted to do that. Whether I'd be good enough to do that was another question, and I was very fortunate, I think, the way it unfolded for me. I went down ironically, I had things like a program column in the Reading program when I was 9 in 1980, and things like that. I wrote my first thing in a Reading program that year, not very well, but it was just always going to happen that way. I think as it unfolded, obviously, my mum recognised that I had an eye for photography by pure accident. I went on a school trip to Normandy, and I've got a sort of a very strong passion, if that's the right word, and fascination with the Second World War. And we went on a school, and like my dad has also got that, and we went, and I happened to go along. My mum just gave me a camera at the last minute and said, take some pictures while you're there when you're on the school trip. And I did pictures of the Bayeux Cathedral and Normandy, and it came back, and my mum said, you've got an eye for this, the way you've taken. So she gave me a camera. I got this battered up old thing, and I took pictures at Arena Essex when it first opened in '84, and then Eastbourne when my brother went there in '84 as well. And I got a picture published very quickly, and I think I just got a love of photography, and that was my in. That was the thing that got me on the centre green. That was the thing that made me feel part of it. It's the first time I had an identity of myself, not anything to do with my dad or my brother. That I had my own skill, if you like it. And then it progressed from there, and then I got myself known that way because I was very lucky to get some decent pictures. We did some stuff. I got stuff used in Speedway Mail, Speedway Star, and then I got in '88, early 1988. There was an opportunity came up at Webster's Publications, which I'd known Phil Rising at Speedway Star and Andrew Skills and Richard Clark just by popping in. My first job was a foot messenger in London for a photographic company. That's I was learning the trade in dark rooms and stuff like that. So, and I used to pop along and drop. It sounds so old-fashioned. It's hard to believe, but my brother used to write a profile in Speedway Star, and every week, and I used to take the disc in. He used to give me the disc, and I'd take the disc in or his copy in an envelope, and I'd hand over the disc to their office in Farringdon, which is where Webster's Publications were, World Soccer, Racing Football Outlook, and Speedway Star. And I used to hand it over the thing, and I knew Phil that way. And so when they had a job came up at Racing Football Outlook as a sort of to someone to input like all the facts and figures and stuff, and they were looking for someone, and Phil asked my dad whether I was available, and that was a great opportunity. I mean, I went there, did that, and then it just gradually moved towards they said, well, why don't you write a bit about Wimbledon and Eastbourne in the magazine? And that's where I started writing, and then it sort of progressed. And then we moved to Kingsreach Tower and Blackfriars with IPC took over the company. IPC didn't want Speedway Star, so that's when we had a management buyout. We used all our redundancies from IPC to buy Speedway Star the title, and that moved to Surbiton. So it was like Phil Rising, Richard Clark, Andrew Skills, Mick Hooker, and myself. And so that's where it was all. So I was quite fortunate. It sort of unfolded that way. And then I left Speedway Star in early 91, and we went and started Speedway Now, which we started that, my brother and I, and that lasted not very long because Wimbledon and Hackney closed down in the period of time that we started it, which were the biggest sales tracks there. So we thought, crikey, do we go down this road? Is Speedway going to survive this, or do we cut our losses? And we sort of we were fortunate that we were selling well, and it hadn't lost money, which was a fortunate thing. But sort of it meant a big change of direction for my brother and I, and we both went into we both separately. We did this sort of thing. My brother did it earlier than I did. I worked for a photographic agency again for a while, which was a good grounding for me photographically wise. But then my brother went to the Daily Mail, and I ended up going to the Sun. I got a very fortunate break, literally, to start the Sun. I met. We were doing a story with. I was press officer for British Speedway in '93. Bizarrely, when they had a company called GJR Promotions ran the promotional side of the sport, and we did a story with Sean Maguire, the old EastEnders character, and he was being taught to ride a speedway bike by Gary Havelock, who I was looking after at the time, and we ended up at Arena Essex, and Sean Maguire was handled. They were trying to make his image. He was in EastEnders, the major character called Aidan in EastEnders, and he was a big character.
It's a pop star as well, wasn't he? I think around about there.
He ended up in a film. He ended up more recently in a film called Gladiator, I think. But Max Clifford, of all people, was his agent. They were trying to make him into this superstar, make the most out of him being this lead character, because he was going to get killed off or something at some stage. So they were trying to seize the day with him and propel his popularity. So they tried to sex him up by him being taught to be a speedway rider by the current world champion. And I did this story at Arena Essex. I went there, turned up as a reporter for the Speedway Mail, and I did the story with Sean and Gary and Max Clifford, who wasn't very happy about stuff. But anyway, that's another thing. But it just so happened I'd started doing shifts at the Sun at the same time. I got on immediately very well with Matthew Wright, who's still on This Morning now, and he still is a really good friend. And we got on him, and Matthew said he saw the stuff I'd done in Speedway. He said, "You've got to come and do shifts. You've got to come and do shifts. You've got an eye for this." And I ended up starting at the Sun with him on the same desk, on the bizarre desk, the showbiz desk, as Matthew Wright, Piers Morgan, and Peter Willis, who was the TV editor, who sadly died recently, who went on to be a great executive at the Mirror. And so I started on my first days with Piers Morgan and Matthew Wright on the same desk. And then I got a call from Gary about 3 weeks later saying, "You're not going to believe this, Sean Maguire's broken his leg at Arena Essex. We're practicing." So this was like about 10 o'clock at night. I lived in Basildon at the time, which was only just down the road from Arena Essex. So I then had this clandestine conversation with Gary saying, "Did anyone get any pictures of this? Is there anything there?" And he went, "I think there's a roll of film somewhere." So I literally dived off at about 10 o'clock at night, got this roll of film, then rang the desk at the Sun and said, "I've got this story, Sean Maguire." And Max Clifford was saying, "No one's to know about this," whatever. And I ended up ringing Piers Morgan at home. They gave me Piers' home number, and I was like, crikey, I've got to ring Piers Morgan. And we ended up getting the story, and it ended up on page 1 of the Sun. And literally the next day we did the follow-up and everything, and I literally went straight. Was about 2 days later, I was marched into the editor's office, which was quite fearsome at the Sun. It was Kelvin Mackenzie at the time, and he basically just slid a bit of paper on where he said, "You've stitched up Max Clifford. There's your contract. You write what you want to be paid on it." And that was it. And I was then at the Sun until full time until 2014. That was in '93. I'd been there for about a year, so I still write for the Sun now. So, but I left as a staff member in late 2014. So that's where it was all born. It was all because Sean Maguire broke his leg. So that was my lucky break, as it were. So, but no, so it's that you get those lucky moments, and I was lucky that Phil Rising, and who was sort of identified someone that I could work with Webster's in 88, and I was fortunate then, and I was very fortunate that I had brilliant people around me then who put up with me as a teenager, and who certainly smoothed a lot of my rough edges off early doors were Andrew Skills and Richard Clark and Riso. They were really good to me, and they gave me a really good grounding, which I needed at the time. I was impetuous. I was typical sort of 17, 18-year-old. I was very flaky, but they kept me in line, and they sort of taught me a lot of basics which I didn't know, but I then was moulded at the Sun into something. I was like Kelvin and Matthew Wright and Ken Gibson was the motoring editor, and people, some fabulous journalists there, like Jane Moore was influential on me there. She's on Loose Women now, she still writes them, and Dawn Neeson, who's writer at the Daily Star. These people were massively influential on me, and so now I've been very lucky to come to work with some really good operators over the years. My dad, and then people like Peter Oakes as well. I mean, Peter Oakes, and there's people in Speedway who I've been very lucky with. The Speedway has been blessed with some damn fine journalists down the years who've been very passionate about it, like Richard Bott, Richard Frost, Peter Oakes. These guys, Keir Radnage was involved in those early days at World Soccer as well. So I've been very lucky to sort of pick up bits and bobs from all these different people who have been at the very top of their game at the very highest level in this country. So I think you need a lot of luck. I certainly feel like I've had a lot of luck down the years, and I've put a lot of hard work into it, but that's because it doesn't feel like hard work if you really love something enough, like I do with writing and obviously the sports I write for. That was a very long answer to a short question, by the way.
But a fantastic answer. But shades of similarity, would you say, between yourself and Peter Oakes, of course, because Peter was a showbiz correspondent on the national papers for a while, and of course using his personal fandom, if you like, and enthusiasm for Speedway to get those stories into the press as well. Do you think there's similarities between the two of you there in your course?
Yeah, and it's interesting because there's a sort of common thread here that there was sort of Eric Linden, who was editor of Speedway Star, was also an executive at TV Times, which is and they all were friends. And Eric Linden was years ahead of his time in publishing terms at TV Times, and he lent that into Speedway. And the guys like my dad and Peter Oakes grew up on that sort of into that industry as well. But it is a ruthless industry, and it always has been a ruthless industry. And anyone who tells you that it's easy is a liar.
And probably there's plenty of people telling you that, particularly when there are major news stories in Speedway around and people are saying, why isn't this on the back pages? Why is this not on the back page of the Sun or the Star or the Mirror? Why is it not on BBC One? Particularly, let's say, the Speedway of Nations, for example. Great Britain won, but to be honest, it was a surprise win. No, it wasn't nailed on that Great Britain had this huge chance of winning that tournament. And it's fantastic that Great Britain won it, but as a result, because it was perhaps a bit of a surprise, and with the best one in the world, Speedway is not the number one sport in Great Britain, it takes a little time to get those stories moving, doesn't it? Just tell us about the realities for Speedway, where Speedway is at, and the realities of getting a Speedway story in a major national newspaper or in front of major national press in whatever format.
Yeah, and it goes much further back than the Speedway of Nations. It's not just about one event, and it's not just about the fact that that Speedway didn't get a huge amount of coverage from it. It's because it goes much deeper than that, and yes, that was a massive result, and yes, it should get its place on national media, and that should be the case. But the trouble is that we've got to a stage where Speedway is so far off the radar of the sports desks of broadcast and print media, or even social media, or even the major players in social media, like the Lad Bibles and the Joe.co.uk's and stuff like that. These are the people who are really where Speedway needs to be. But it's gone so far down the line where Speedway has not done anything to represent itself on a regular basis on those back benches of the sports desk, that even when something big does happen, it just doesn't make a murmur, and they're going, and it's just like, oh, what's that? It's not, you've got to have this regularity. It's got to be constantly in focus on those desks where Speedway is a regular thing. And now, if it doesn't happen, then obviously when something big happens, it's just they go, oh, we've not. There's a whole art to how you produce sport into a paper. Like we explained this before on the Speedway GB podcast, but there is only one page of other sport, 1 or 2 pages of other sport in most papers now, apart from football. There's a good reason for that, is that football drives, I would say, 90% of the readers for tabloid papers, the popular papers. That's why people buy papers, is for sport more than anything. And obviously advertising revenues are driven around football. That's where the money is. That's where they get their 25 before adverts, quarter pages, all the big page ads. That's all about sport. It's all about football, rather. That's going to be sort of BT or whatever are going to put big ads, or Adidas or whoever. So that's football. You can't touch it. You can't argue with it. That's going to get the majority shareholder of those pages. So you're left with 1 or 2 pages, and that's what Speedway's got to fight for. In amongst really top class sport, cricket, when you've got Ashes on, you've got Test matches, you've got Formula One, rugby, snooker, darts, these guys, and you look at Formula One at the minute, where we've got sort of Verstappen and Hamilton going head to head. There's controversy, there's arguments, there's rows. Those rows aren't any different to what we see in Speedway, but Formula One allows them to evolve and allows them to get out there, and then people are, we've got Formula One have got people who want to push that agenda, and darts have got the same. We've got, dare I say, journalists like me who will go and there's been. Peter Wright has been said recently that during the match play during the year, so there was, he said, I'm going to win the match play. All the other players said in a couple of interviews, oh, we're sick of him being so mouthy. He needs to keep his gob shut. The minute you have stories like that, and suddenly you've got journalists like me who says Peter Wright's been told to keep his gob shut, that's going to make a headline. Has Speedway produced anything like that in the last whenever? No, there hasn't. Nothing's come out. In fact, Speedway tries to hide all its controversy, tries to play it all down. We don't want to see fights. We don't want to do this. We don't want people to say nasty things. We don't want promoters slamming phones down on centre greens. They're going to get fined. You're not allowed to say this. You can't. So that's step number one. Is Speedway's got to allow itself, and I've said that before, and it's got to, and the riders themselves have got to allow themselves to say what they want to say, instead of just, the only person who really sort of gets stuck in usually is Tai, and that's why Tai is the biggest marketable asset Speedway's had in the last decade, probably, if not the biggest and most popular marketable riders British Speedway has ever had. You would argue, certainly, because he can back up. If he opens his mouth, he's got the titles to show for it. So it's a big battle. If you actually, I see this on a daily basis. I do this. I file a story on Speedway every single day of the week, of the year. Probably, but the only day is Christmas Eve, because there's not a paper on Christmas Day. So,
yeah.
But you have to do that, and you have to do it in a certain way, and you have to make sure that story is good enough. Because if you start finding stories, they just go, oh, Spike, it's just Speedway, and it's got to be good enough, and you've got to have to know how to do it. Peter Oakes knows what he's doing. Peter Oakes knows they know. That backbench at the Daily Star know that he's going to present. When they say that they're going to actually give him a space for a column every week, they know that it's not going to be naff. They know that Peter Oakes is going to produce something that's punchy and it's talkable. It's going to make people talk about it, sort of stuff. So, that's what I have to try and do at the Sun as well. And it's not an easy thing to do, but there's got to be. Speedway's got to think about that element instead of, and I made this point in Speedway Star as well. I sort of stuck my head above the parapet and said, there's a reason why Speedway doesn't get coverage, and people need to stop moaning about it and start doing something about it, because it needs to be said. Speedway can't continue moaning about not having coverage when it buries its head in the sand. If you're going to do that, you've got to. There's a reason for doing it. There's a reason, for every people have got to understand what. So ask the question: why does darts get it? Why does Formula One get it? Why does snooker get? Because they've got people like Ronnie O'Sullivan. Ronnie O'Sullivan's no better a character than Tai Woffinden. But if you actually have a look at what the coverage Ronnie O'Sullivan gets compared to Tai Woffinden a year, and what actually the sport looks like when you think how exciting Speedway is compared to snooker. It's a disgrace, really. You think, well, how does that happen? How does someone like Peter Wright, who's got nothing on Tai Woffinden as far as Tai Woffenden's, what he does and puts his neck on the line and what he's achieved and being 3 times world champion. He throws a dart at the ball, Peter Wright, but he's getting acres of column inches. People got to ask the question why that is happening and how important is that? And does Speedway really believe that that's important? Now, there's a breakdown in communication here because the fans think it's important. If you look at the forums and you look at social media and the way people moaned about the fact that BBC weren't covering it or the national press weren't, they are moaning about it, saying, why aren't we getting this? But why should Speedway get that? It's because there's some sort of breakdown here because part of the sport doesn't think it's necessary to force that issue. There's not enough thought process or actual. No one's actually sat down and said, why aren't we getting this? And why are they getting it? And why aren't we? And what have we got to do to achieve that? And so Speedway's got to stop thinking that we're entitled to this coverage because no one's entitled to anything. What does Speedway bring to a national press? Is it going to sell them 250,000 more papers? No, it's not. So it's got to build from the bottom now. It's got to start all again. Speedway, as I said, was getting back pages in the early 80s, but now it's gone. It's got to sell itself again. It's got to actually convince people to convince sports editors that it's worthwhile being in their paper. And it took a lot to get Tai Woffinden. We got a spread on Tai Woffinden in the Sun before the British Grand Prix. I think it was in 2013, 2014. And honestly, it took 3 or 4 months to organise that. With the sports editor, Mike Dunn, who's the former sports editor at the Sun, it took a lot of wheeling and dealing and schmoozing and back-patting and working out how we would get a spread on Tai Woffinden. And it was a great shot of him and Faye together. But it took a long time. And so that's the sort of thing that Speedway's got to understand. I don't think anyone's asked the question why it hasn't got to that point where other sports have overtaken it. But it's a big, long road back to get that. But people have got to understand as well that there's a reason for why it's not getting that coverage, and it's just got Speedway's just got to allow itself to look at other sports and go, well, what we can be controversial. We can. It doesn't have to be controversial, by the way. It can be other funny, quirky stories, But injury stories are really good as well. And I know it sounds awful, but. When people love a daredevil, we talk about Eddie Kidd was, emotional thing on Top Gear the other day, which got fabulous coverage and rightly so. Proper hero. But there's no reason. Eddie Kidd was jumping over buses and whatever and breaking his leg and whatever. That's no different from the sort of how speedway riders come across. So why isn't that? Why isn't that happening? And people have got to ask that question. But because It should do, and there's a way of doing it, but no one's asked a publicist how to do it. He said.
Yes, and if you know any publicists, I'm sure Phil can help you out.
There's a big difference between. There's also a discourse as well. There's a big difference between the press office, because the press office of British Speedway does a really good job. It gets all the information out there, and it's regular, and it does the right things. But there's a difference between a press office and a publicist, and there's a big difference. And people don't think. I don't think people understand what the difference is. And but that's, listen. I'm not criticising the British press office, because I think they do a really stern service, and a stern job, I should say. And they got some people very passionate about what they do. And British Speedway is pretty lucky to have certainly the extent of people they have who don't get paid either any money or very little money to do that.
Phil Lanning, my guest on Humans of Speedway, journalist and also publicist. And we're going to talk more about that in the next part, because Phil has worked alongside some of the biggest names in Speedway: Gary Havelock, Jason Crump, Tai Woffinden, to name drop just a few that he's helped get into the media in many different ways, beyond just the news stories, but getting into magazines and getting on TV. So we will speak with Phil about his work with some of those world champions in just a few moments here on Humans of Speedway. You're listening to Humans of Speedway. I'm Ian Brannan. Now, 2021 is drawing to a close at the time of recording this. And it has been a bit of a tricky year. But here at Humans of Speedway, we want to send you off into the festive period with the perfect gift of free beer. Because we've teamed up with Beer 52, who are offering Speedway fans the chance to get 10 free beers. All you have to do is go to beer52.com/speedway and then pay for the postage of this, which is £5.95 to get a case of 10 top quality beers to your house. Claim your free case. And what's more, do it before the 17th of December. Usually you get 8 beers, but do it before the 17th and you'll get those 2 extra beers as well. So they send experts around the globe to Beer 52, finding the best beer available anywhere. And your little case, when it comes, will probably have a bit of a theme to a certain country. Now, I don't know what that theme will be at this moment in time, but I know some people have had Croatia featured. I know that the one I got featured lots of beers from the likes of Belgium and Germany. So maybe you'll get one of those. You can specify whether you want a light beer or dark beers. If you just like your light beers like me, then you can click on that. And you get beer from more than 40 countries across 5 continents. And you also get a magazine as well, and some delicious snacks to wash down with that beer. So what's not to love? After redeeming your first case, you'll join the monthly beer club. It's £24 a month, but there's no minimum commitment. You can pause or cancel at any time. So grab this deal while it's there. 10 free beers, beer52.com/speedway, and enjoy. Cheers to Speedway fans everywhere. Right now, back to our guest, Phil Lanning, in this episode of Humans of Speedway. Now, Phil, as you'll know, is a writer, writes great stories in the Speedway Star. The Sun newspaper, as is already talked about. But something else he does is work as a publicist. And the job of a publicist is to get whoever it might be out there, whether that's into magazines or guests on TV shows or whatever. Get the celebrity status going, if you like. And Phil has worked with the likes of Gary Havelock, Jason Crump and Tai Woffinden, and continues to do so to represent their interests when it comes to this kind of coverage. And Phil, tell us about that work. The sort of things that you've done, but also for any younger riders listening to this, what they should be thinking about and how they should be positioning themselves if they want to get a nice bit of publicity and be appealing to these magazines or TV shows or whatever it might be.
Well, I've been fortunate to work with a sort of smorgasbord of different characters and who've wanted different things out of a publicist. Like, for instance, I worked with Jason Jason Crump from 1997 onwards, and Jason's relationship with me was that he didn't want to do press. He didn't want to have anything to do with it. He was so focused on getting to where he wanted to be he wanted me just to mop up and make sure he didn't have to deal with any of it, which is fine. Which meant I got to shape how he came across, which was fine. He had a certain agenda, which was fine. Whereas I've been very fortunate to work with Gary Havelock since '91 onwards, and he wanted to be on chat shows, and he wanted to abseil down the side of the Eiffel Tower, and he wanted to do anything. Gary would have jumped off the Niagara Falls if it meant getting a play. I mean, that's why we ended up getting 12 pages in GQ magazine with him, because he had a very, very interesting story, and he was sort of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, Gary, and that's what appeals to like those sort of publications or the national press. So you have to find your character. It only works for certain characters, riders. You can create characters to a certain extent, but that rider has to want that. Speedway, you have to be very careful, because controversy can lead to vendettas and feuds on track, which is something you've always got to be very, very careful about, because you don't want to create something falsely that then ends up in someone getting stuck in a fence somewhere. But over the years, you sort of learn to sort of, as I said, the rider has got to have a want to understand what publicity equals and what the outcome of that is. And people like Gary and Tai Woffinden understand what that brings to their brand, if you like. And so you have to have that starting point. But they also have to lend themselves to someone like myself, who will then pick up on things topical, which are I'm convinced I'm convinced, and I've said this for some time, that Tai Woffinden is an absolute cert at some stage to go on to I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here. We have spoken about it before. I've spoken about it with Tai before. We actually had the actual person who was involved who I helped involve with to get that spread in the Sun a few years ago with Tai and Faye, was actually the guy who handled Eric Bristow, who was actually an I'm a Celebrity, and we went down the same route to try and get Tai in it. Obviously not easy when we're dealing with Tai early on, because he was sort of, to go and do that it takes a lot of preparations. But Tai's the sort of bloke, that's what you sort of need. You need someone who's got that open-mindedness to say, this is what, this is going to... I'm convinced that Tai will go on I'm a Celebrity one day and will go and win it, and will be the greatest thing for Speedway, because he's the sort of bloke who'd do anything and eat anything, and, he'd end up being a leader of the camp and everything. So that's sort of what you need. You need a rider to have that capacity. I don't think Jason Crump, for instance, he was so focused and so professional on riding the bike and his technical ability and what he wanted to achieve. He didn't want to do that. He wanted just to carry on, and that was fine. But you've got these other characters, and you have to identify them, like when they're younger, and find out, well, right, okay, how do we shape this character? How do we make this person into someone different? And so it is important to find those people. If you're asking me who I would pick now, that would be a difficult question, because I know all those young lads now, but you'd have to start now. You have to sort of get into them and sort of say, right, who, there's people like, I think there's certain elements of certain riders now I look at and I think, well, he's got something about him. Tom Brennan, for me, is very, very workable, and he understands the value of publicity. And I work with Tom quite closely now. And all these other guys, they just need a bit more confidence at this age, like the Drew Kemps, Carl Bickley, Anders Rowe. Once they get a bit more confidence and they sort of make the mark in where they're going to be, at what the level's going to be, then you can create something. And that's what you need to identify. And once you get that side of them, then you can shape them into the person you want them to be, and get them to say, well, when they get into instances where they've had a bit of controversy, or they've had a bit of a dig at somebody, or they want to say something controversial, then but they need to be able to carry that further for you. And people like Gary and Tai have managed to do that. These guys don't come along all the time, but ultimately you need a sport to embrace that sort of culture, and then you can allow these characters to come through. Speedway didn't really underplay, British Speedway really underplayed Nicky Pedersen, as being the pantomime villain. We've got darts at the moment. We've got a pantomime villain in Gerwin Price. He's the world champion. He's getting booed everywhere, and it constantly causes story. The minute you got bruise or jeers or that sort of thing with a crowd, it just creates headlines and papers. They just love that. They love that sort of that story. People love a villain. People love pantomime villains, like their old wrestling days, like the Giant Haystacks and Big Daddy. Nothing's changed. nothing's changed whatsoever. But you want a good guy and I want a bad guy, and sometimes you need to pick on riders who want to be the bad guy. There's a lot of guys who want to be that person, and naturally go into that. And so that's what it just takes time. This is not something you just go like that and click your fingers and you work. It takes time to identify people and how they're going to shape themselves to be. You know, we've had the years like the Kenny Carter years where Kenny became that character because he was outspoken. And there's people like that. There's lots of riders now are outspoken. There's lots of them there now. But if I do that story now, you just get dogs abuse, and that rider then gets dogs abuse. So you have to sort of, you have to pick on these things and pick on these moments. So, but it is there and it's workable. It just needs someone to do it.
And it's just a bit of personality, I suppose, isn't it? Which can be a little bit alien, I think, maybe to riders, because they are, as you touched on, not every rider is up for that. But there might be riders who have got a bit of personality. Maybe they keep a lid on it because they don't want to stir things up online or get in trouble with the authorities. But at the same time, it's that extra bit of personality, as you mentioned, a pantomime villain that people really do latch onto, isn't it? I mean, look at Nicky Pedersen, for example. He's just love him or hate him, everybody knows him.
I totally agree with you. I think we are in a curious time in society where if you do say something, you do get jumped on and piled on very quickly in social media. It is, I think every sportsman has become more wary of what they're saying. But I think Speedway's in at a different level of that, and I think it needs to sort of, I think like for instance, the Worrell brothers are really can be very controversial, and they speak their minds very eloquently. I thought Steve handled himself. Steve was getting lots of stick on social media this year from fans, and he handled that. And I did the interview with him, and he was absolutely eloquent the way he handled that and the way he delivered it. And he delivered a really strong riposte in a very, very dignified manner and a very, very, very clever manner. There's people like Dan Bewley is absolutely going down this route. Dan Bewley's going to have no filter, and he's going to say what he wants to say, and he's very clever. And people underestimate Dan Bewley because he's got a really, really sharp mind. I love interviewing Dan because we joust with each other, and he sort of knows what I'm trying to do, and then but he's got a way about him. But he says what he wants to say, and he won't hold back. Dan, once he's established himself a bit more, is going to end up being a very, very big value asset. Unfortunately, not in the British Speedway, but he certainly still is a British rider, and that's going to be massive. Whatever happens for the British press. So that you can, as you rightly say, you can identify the riders. There's other riders who are quite good as well. There's Charles Wright, Louis Kerr. There's people who've got Jordan Palin, as well. Is another guy who's going to, once he gets a bit more out of himself, you can tell he's going to have a raw attribute about speaking his mind. And that's what you really want. I see a lot of that in a lot of these younger generation, and I'm constantly looking at that purely out of selfishness because I'm going to seize on these guys because that makes my life easier. And I think, well, like Tom Brennan is an absolute dream. We haven't had too much controversy with him yet or anything like that, but he just allows me to sort of speak to him and say, look, what about this and what about that? And I sort of just gently cajole him into certain things, and he sort of understands why that, and he says, yeah, no, I believe in that, whatever. So that's what and he's learning that trade. It is just as important for every single one of these riders to learn the power and the value of how they sell their brand into the media as it is to how they ride that track and score points. And I think there's the only people I know who are actually teaching that are the Great Britain Speedway team, about how the riders conduct themselves in the media and how they produce that. Because without the sponsorship and without the branding and without the publicity, they can't pay for the bikes to make them go fast, to go around the track, to win races. That is a basic value of a speed rider. And I think certainly now with what they can do on social media and how they can project themselves on their own, and there's certain riders doing that quite well, but they need to take that next step and how to get it into the national press. But it can be done, and the intelligent riders will understand that value, and they always have done. But intelligent riders are always the ones who end up winning world titles. But there's never been a non-intelligent rider who doesn't understand all of this as part of the package who's become a world champion. They all know, and that's what cuts the real mustard with these guys now.
Knowing what we know now, and a throwback to an article that your dad wrote. In fact, it was a book about 50 golden years of Speedway, which was a World of Sport thing many years ago in 1978. If you remember this, he predicted what Speedway would look like in 2020. And now we're obviously beyond that. I wondered what your thoughts were, another Lanning prediction of what Speedway would be like again in another 10 to 20 years. I mean, the sort of things that he foretold would be female Speedway riders, and we are starting to see those. Worldwide television coverage of American and Australian meetings, which we're not quite there yet. Standardisation of track lengths. Some other things that he foresaw was moving the riding age to 12. He also wanted a World Cup every 4 years, and obviously that came about. Computerised starting to alleviate rolling starts. He was ahead of his time, because these are the things that people are saying even now. Where do you think Speedway will be further down the line, given another 10 or 20 years or so?
I think it's interesting you brought up that article from my dad's 50 golden years of Speedway. It was the Jubilee. There was some nonsense in that as well, by the way. But it was. I think he said that Poland would dwindle, but he was right actually about that, because obviously the Eastern Europe was always going to have a problem coming out of the Eastern Bloc. But I think this. Listen. As far as female riders are concerned, I think that would be. I mean, nothing would make Speedway be elevated very quicker than if Katie Gordon got a championship place and started winning races. I mean, that would be monumental. Look at the Fallon Sherrock effect in darts from 2 years ago, and there is, without a shadow of doubt, she is the most talked about and most famous darts player in the world right now, and she hasn't won a title. She's just won a handful of matches, and that gives you and she was getting headlines in the Washington Post for beating a man on stage. Now, if Katie Gordon was to do that, or Rachel, or whoever, that would be monumental. But that we're talking ideals. As far as Speedway is concerned, as far as on a global level, I think I'd like, in an ideal world, I think that's actually lends itself to what you're saying, what my dad said. I think the idea with Speedway was that Speedway would go down the lines, and I certainly think with the Grand Prix that it had an idea that Speedway would go down the lines of Formula One. And there was an idea that I think Phil Rising at one stage said it was very close that Bernie Ecclestone nearly got involved in the sport just before the Grand Prix series was brought in. And I think the idea is that Speedway will become more based on its stadia and its situation. And so the idea is hopefully that it will go down. So we'll hopefully, this is my own personal hope as well, is that we come away from these sort of naff stadia. And I always find it a bit difficult to understand why we go from Cardiff to Tetro or somewhere where, I think that the branding of the whole sport, I think Discovery will want to probably make it a little bit more more refined, and I think the idea was to take Speedway in the Grand Prix further abroad and make it less Europe-centric, which is, again, that was mentioned in the Discovery blueprint, if you like. So I would not be surprised, and if over the next decade maybe, that we sort of come away from those more sort of rural-looking agricultural European venues, and we just start ended up in maybe Dubai or Bahrain or somewhere. I don't know. I mean, if they can refine how much they spend on, or can spend more even on the temporary tracks. When you look at Warsaw as a venue, and obviously the Principality, that Speedway has shown, and they've Ollie Olsen, and then since then with Phil Morrison as well, is that they've shown they can put on these venues anywhere. And when Speedway's in those venues, when it's in really top class stadia, it just looks completely different, and it just takes it from being this sort of tin pot sport into world class sport. And I think that's where hopefully Speedway will go. I mean, my dream is that we got Dan Bewley. Dan Bewley is sort of tussling for a world title with Jack Holder and Jamin Lidsey in Bahrain in 2029 or something maybe. I mean, that's what you want. That's where you want it to be. You want that sort of scenario, and I think that's where Discovery want to take it. Whether they achieve that is another thing. They said some really good stuff, and I was very impressed with their production and their sort of the way they promoted it and where their graphics and everything. It looked good. Hopefully they carry that through, because if they do, the spin-off and when I think there was there was a bit of bleating about what impact that would have on British Speedway and whatever. I think that the trickle down would be very, very, very good for British Speedway.
Yeah, I do too, and I think that everything they're talking about, if they make it happen, and they have got huge resources, and that's the other thing that I think probably a lot of people don't realise about Discovery. Currently at the time of the recording this, they're in to buy BT Sport, or at least take all their stuff. So Discovery are going to be a massive sporting channel, probably bigger than BT Sport are now, given a couple of years. So probably giving Sky a real run for their money further down the line. So this is a fantastic time for Speedway to be involved with them and to be in their early doors as well. And it's a big thing. And knowing you've got that commitment ahead for 10 years or so is brilliant. And as you say, give it time. It's baby steps at the moment. But as Phil Morris said on the official British Speedway podcast, the last one we did at the end of this season, it's like, give it this year, next year or whatever, but 3 or 4 years from now, you're going to see a big difference in how things are presented. One other thing to mention to you, because obviously you have continued the Lanning Speedway Association, but it doesn't stop there, because your son Taylor Lanning is involved in Speedway now. People will have seen his photographs, no doubt, on social media or in the Speedway Star or maybe further afield. But very much like you, really, chip off the old block, starting out as a photographer and involved in the sports and, really making waves and getting involved in the very highest level as the official photographer for the Great Britain team. And it must be nice and pleasing for you to see and a proud moment to see his work on the Speedway Star as well.
Yeah, and so he's been very fortunate to get good people. I mean, Jeff Davis has been terrific towards him and stuff, and in Speedway. And Speedway's very fortunate that it's got good people around. He's got, and I think that's been important for a bit. Very similar to my upbringing was that I had when I was coming, as I said to you earlier in the conversation. When I was 15, 16, 17, 18. That's those really informative years, those very influential years. I had very good people around me, and I think Speedway's given him that opportunity where he's had people like Peter Oakes and Josh Gudgeon, Great Britain, Rob Painter and Vicky Blackwell have been absolutely phenomenal to him. And that backroom team at Great Britain, as a 17, 18-year-old kid, they've really got a grip of him, and sort of they've really been very good advice in all areas of life, not just photography or whatever, but as a human being, and that's given him a lot of security. And so I think if he was here having this conversation with me, he would say that Rob Painter and Vicky Blackwell have been his greatest guides and his greatest support, and that's been important to him to have those people around him. That will help him mature into something much greater, hopefully. I mean, he seems to be going down the right path, and he seems to be making the right progress. But I was a photographer and went into writing. I don't think he'll do the same. He can write, but I don't think he'll go down the same route. I think he loves his photography too much.
Yeah, well, all the best to him. And I think, a lot of people enjoy seeing his photos. They are different, I suppose, but times change, and, he's really embraced that sort of artistic side of it. It's really good to see. And the Lanning name continues in the sports, and we'll have more from Phil Lanning in just a couple of moments, because next we're going to discuss what his dream Speedway meeting would look like in our Speedway Paradise feature, which is a regular feature on Humans of Speedway. If you're new to this podcast, all our guests answer these similar questions about how their dream Speedway meeting would look. And that's what we're going to tackle in just a couple of moments on Humans of Speedway. You're listening to Humans of Speedway, which is part of the Sports Social Podcast Network. Head over to sport-social.co.uk and find your next favourite sporting podcast. There's all sorts included there, from Premier League football to cricket, tennis, NFL. It's all covered. And of course, Speedway as well, not least the official British Speedway podcast and this one, Humans of Speedway. And now my guest, Phil Lanning, is going to tell us about how his dream Speedway meeting would look. When you've seen as much Speedway as Phil Lanning has through his life, there's a lot of experience to draw upon. So we'll start with that first question, Phil. And I know you've been putting a lot of thought into this, so much so you almost missed a Sun deadline. But where would you hold your dream meeting in terms of just the track? So we're having a track to race your dream Speedway match on, but which track would you choose?
I would have to say Peterborough. I think Peterborough, probably, I don't mean this in an unkind way, not in the last couple of years. I think they changed the surface to clay and it's not been quite the same, but certainly in the 80s and 90s, maybe further than that Peterborough always for me was absolutely breathtaking. For me, it was narrow, it was fast, and people used to go past each other and chop back up, so you could go inside, outside, and it was always, I mean, it actually made my heart beat faster watching there, and I watch a lot of Speedway, and I think I've seen some fantastic meetings there. I think that, we used to do quite a lot of the Fours meetings on ITV in the 80s with my dad for Anglia with Jerry Harrison, and they were always sensational. I mean, and it's rare to see a bad meeting at Peterborough. And so I would have to say Peterborough, for me, has been consistently the track over my lifetime that I've always been, wow, this is going to be good.
And do you recall your dad ever mentioning a favourite track of his? Because, I mean, he's been to some weird and wonderful tracks around the world and around Europe in particular, some of which probably don't exist anymore. But did he ever mention that there was one sort of standout place he loved going more than any?
That's a good question, actually. I never asked my dad what his favourite track was. I think he always, he would have probably answered in a similar way to me. He would always judge something. He would never let, as a commentator, he always wanted to go somewhere where it was easy to sell, or it's going to be like Nigel would say the same thing. If you just said to Nigel, if you're going to go to, his heartbeat's going to beat. He thinks, I don't have to sell Torren to you. When we go into a Grand Prix at Torren, it's going to be good. Whereas the Marquetta can be grim. So I think he would always judge something on what he knew that was going to be good. I think. So he always enjoyed the Fours at Peterborough. He always said that was always never let you down. Peterborough never ever. And I think that there was a couple of other tracks he used to enjoy. I think the Polish tracks, he always said Katowice was always pretty decent, and so was Vetlanda. He liked Vetlanda quite a lot because you always produced good racing. I'm not too sure what else he said about the UK, to be honest. I don't think King's Lynn always used to be pretty decent as well in those days as well.
Yeah, the old Saddlebow Road. So Peterborough, then a fantastic track. However, with the best will in the world, the stadium around it, we could do with a few more seats. If we were going to put the Peterborough track into the ideal stadium as a place to sit and watch and enjoy Speedway, which stadium would you put that track in? I
would have to say Wimbledon. With that was something about Wimbledon. There was the marble floors. The glass, the just the whole thing. You felt like you're going somewhere. You felt like you're going to a theatre or a big show or going to something special. It was, or the cinema in those days. It was something you walked in and you felt like. I mean, we were very lucky. We used to go there on a Thursday night and go for something to eat as a family, and to sit at a Speedway meeting and have table service food and. With my mum and dad and the three of us as children was something very, very special to us, and it was, that was the times we had the best family times together sometimes, and but we went there and watched league meetings as well. We'd just go, right, we're going to go to Wimbledon tonight. I'd come home from school and mum would say, we're going to go and pick Dad up from London and go on to Wimbledon, which was like massively exciting. And so, but Wimbledon, there was a certain sound behind the glass as well. At Wimbledon, it had a uniqueness about it. There was that feeling, as I said, you walked in, it was marble floors, everything was immaculately clean. Something very special about it. And by the way, the track was bloody great as well. So it didn't let you down in that sense. It was a really good track as well. It's not far away from being the complete place, to be fair. But Wimbledon for me was something very special. I would have to say, and this has caused me great pain, and I said this before we started talking, was that this gave me great pain about where would be my ideal stadium, because even though it's not glamorous whatsoever, but Eastbourne was undoubtedly my first love. And if someone said to me tomorrow, you can only go to one more Speedway meeting, and it's only one place you can go to, it would be Eastbourne. That would be it for me, because Eastbourne to me is everything, and it's where my heart was, and still is. And when I go down to Eastbourne now, I haven't been for a bit actually, but when I go, I can feel the same. I can see Bob Dugard, Charlie, my dad, my mum. My mum was an announcer there for a while. Obviously, Margaret Dugard in the Rabbit Hutch on the first bend. That for me is my childhood. It takes me straight back. I can hear Knowing Me, Knowing You by ABBA playing. It's that Sunday afternoon thing, and I can see Neil and Colin Richardson and Paul Gachet and Gordon Kennett. So as a stadium, Wimbledon they're very, very special to me. Very, very, and it breaks my heart that that's gone. I can't even think of it. Briggo went to the new Plough Lane football the other day, I gather. I couldn't even like the tweet that he was there, because Speedway Star did the tweet that Briggo was back at Plough Lane. I said, I can't even, because it breaks my heart that they knocked that place down, because it's. I saw it on Sweeney the other day. It was on the Sweeney. They had an episode of the Sweeney, and there was a bit of Wimbledon. It was stock cars at Wimbledon Speedway, and there's a bit as well from White City, which was a good old track.
Yes,
so
yes.
I'm showing my age now when I'm talking about the Sweeney and the professionals.
But it's kind of ridiculous that we're in a position at the moment with no Speedway team in London as well, which is obviously something that could do with remedying at some point. Oxford is close, but it's not London.
Yeah, well, a London track would be, if someone could say to me in an ideal world in Speedway, to get a London track would be massive. To have and to have a Midlands base, like to have a Bellevue, Coventry, and a London track again would be central London. I mean, not just if someone said to us, we're going to get a track round, the London Stadium or somewhere like that, where obviously Hackney was, then it'd be perfect. So, but we can but hope.
Okay, on to your all-time 1 to 7 then. Any rider from any era, no points limits, alive or not. It's entirely over to you, and I know that this has caused you a lot of thoughts.
Yes, wow, and I'm sure I'm not alone in this. I don't think anyone to pick their 1 to 7 is literally impossible. I actually had to write it down,
okay,
because it gave me. I went through some permutations. Again, I've based this on the fact that this is my. If I was to pick an all-time team to win every meeting, I could easily do that of Major, Olsen, Ricardson, Crump, whatever, but I haven't done that. I've done this based on riders who I've really loved watching over the years, and I think would bring actually. So my number one would be Gordon Kennett, who would never let you down as number one. He was an absolute force of nature, and during that period of time at Eastbourne in the mid-80s, he was just on a different level. And when Eastbourne won everything in the second tier did the double, he was sensational, and his will to win is second. I've never seen that in another Speedway rider. Well, I have actually, but he's coming up in a minute. So, Bruce Penhall for me, growing up was the ultimate Speedway rider, because he had Hollywood glitz about him. He was sensational. 81 and 82 World Finals were off the scale. Bobby Schwartz was in the 1980 Reading team, which was so close to my heart. That meant a lot to me that year, and still does. Bobby was the ultimate team man, perfect captain, and a huge character. What a character he was. A bit of closer to home, Jason Crump would be in this team. Obviously, I'm biased, but Jason just every single race he rode 100%. Everywhere he went, every single night, never gave anything less. And he was a force of nature, a bit like Gordon Kennett in that sense, where he was just, his determination and single-mindedness and focus was ruthless, and he would have to be in that team for me. Likewise, Gary Havelock would be in that team. Gary was a bit more like a firework, where his career jettisoned for a shorter period of time and burned out quicker, if you like. But Gary, in his pomp, was a massive influence, and again, he would be, even on the toughest nights, he would find something extra. I've seen him ride. I mean, obviously, everyone talks about '92 World Final where he found something special in his character. But there's times I saw him in the Cup Final at Arena Essex in '93 with Bradford when he was just off the scale. If you wound Gary up enough, he would just be absolutely sensational. And he was a big night rider as well. Again, something very close to my heart was Todd Wiltshire. He would be in that team. Todd was. If Todd hadn't been injured the way he was in '92, I think he would have gone on to win World Championships. He made starts like I'd never seen before. He was absolutely off the scale as well. And Todd had that raw ability to make starts where he could have dominated for years if he hadn't. It's such a bad back and pelvis injury. And when he came back, he still did quite well when he came back, but it was not to the level I think he would have made. And Darcy Ward would be in there. Darcy was my most exciting rider I've seen in a generation, without a shadow of a doubt. And again, he would have gone on to do a lot more. And I'm affording myself a number 8, which I'm cheating the system. I would probably put Martin Dugard in at number 8. Again, that's a pure bias. That again, Martin had a will to win at a domestic level, which I would always want in my team. That sheer passion for his club, and so there's, like anyone else, I could have picked. I can't. I'm looking at that team. But Dennis Sigalis doesn't make that team. Tai Woffinden isn't in that team. I'm looking at going, how on earth have I not got them in there? But hey, you only gave me 7, and I've cheated with 1 as well.
And great shouts there, and some riders that people like Gary Havelock, for example, who we've obviously spoken to on this series about a year ago, I think now, and was fantastic. And for me, he was my sort of idol, I suppose, when I was younger and going to Bradford and stuff, and in that era that you talk about. So it was great personally for me to talk to him. But he does speak very well about that World Final in Poland where he became the world champion, and how he was almost sick in his helmet because when at the dawning moment when he thought this is it, and it was just he just got out the traps and got a flyer and just never looked back and just clung on for a minute.
Yeah, I can't. I find it very tough to watch '92 without being emotional, and also 2004 with Jason. I think Jason's first world title for me was. I honestly, it makes me. It's tough to watch because I do well up, but Gary's was something very special for me because it was the first time I was involved with someone who'd become a world champion, and it was there was something special there, and the whole thing about Gary, the way he went about himself, and all the sort of the ideas that we had about his Kevlars and his dreadlocks and all the braiding and all that. It was all a bit of fun. I think the whole thought process was a bit of fun to start. We're just being mavericks, really, and he was a maverick. But then suddenly to be there and thinking, Christ, he's going to win this. It's like it still feels like a fairy tale to this day to be for that moment, and it was such a big thing. And it's again for me growing up as a one-off world final, when I've seen Penhall win in '81 and you all this, well, it was such a big thing when you were world champion. It was just like, you were majors, you're on the same trophy as them, but to actually see someone who was my best friend to actually do that was just mind-blowing. And it still is this day, the whole thing, the whole theatre of that night, and the Hollywood aspect and what was leading up to that night as well. That whole thing where people, he had the faith healer about his broken wrist after he broke it just before the Commonwealth final, and all those different stages, and then to get to the final and then have the 75-minute delay when he really needed it because that he might not have made that rerun, and all of those things you could write a Hollywood script around that night, and it was written in the stars. And I still have to this day I have a chain around my neck, and I still have to this day a yin and yang and a number 8 around my chain, because I'm convinced that was written in the stars, because he had a yin and yang on his back spoiler, and he was drawn at number 8, which is a lucky number in the Chinese lucky number. And I'm convinced that contrived. I mean, I might be talking complete baloney, but for me, for years, it was just such a night of pure theatre, of where, wow, this was written in the stars. How did this happen? and the way it unfolded, and like every race he had, the next guy he beat, he sort of eliminated every guy from the leaderboard, and then he was just left with winning that last race. And he had again gate 2 again, which was like, oh god, gate 2, and it was but he just, everything went, it was just a complete fairy tale for me. And that whole thing with Scott Trigg, I mean, and Brian Lana, and obviously Gary's dad Brian, and that whole feeling was such a I've got goose pimples now thinking about it. Honestly, I will never. When I take my dying breath, I will remember that night, and him and Jason in 2004. That bizarre race, the terrifying race when Jason was world champion. When he had the year before, and when he lost it to Nicky, and he got excluded in the semi-final, was a god awful night. I put my foot through a bathroom door at home watching it, and I ruined. I ruined a plant. I kicked a plant and Taylor was watching it with me. He was in his cot. Would you believe? He was only a year old, and I was watching it with him, and it was I wasn't best pleased. But the year after, it then ended up in that bizarre race where everyone got excluded, and he ended up. So Ryan Sullivan got excluded, I think, and someone else did. Runa Holter touched the tapes, and then Ryan Sullivan got excluded on 2 minutes, and it was about 3 or 4 reruns. And it ended up making qualifying for the semi-final almost by default, and it was like, again, that relief and that night of him winning it, having got so close 3 years previously, was massive. And these are days which I'll never forget. I talk about it to Jason now. I'm seeing Jason in a couple of days actually. He's coming up to Glasgow, and he just brushes it off like it was like he'd gone to get his hair cut. I talk about it like it's something, this monumental thing I'll never forget, and he goes, "Oh yeah. Yeah, it was all right that night, wasn't it?" You just go. So, but no, I think that Gary night was something out of Roy the Rovers that night,
and obviously made a massive difference to his life there on, and obviously to you as well. I mean, you've now got somebody who was previously a very marketable character in the sport, who's now world champion. It's a dream for you. And I remember going to Bradford the first meeting, probably the week after he'd won it, where they had these big massive quad bike things there, trikes, massive trikes, and took him round like the sort of trikes you have at the start of the British Grand Prix sometimes now, when they bring the riders out like that, parading him around. And Odsal was rammed that night, and it was almost like the meeting, and nobody can actually remember who they rode against or what the meeting was. It was
Arena Essex, and he got 14, and he was only beaten by Peter Rawn because they said, you lost the race. What was that all about? You're supposed to be a world champion, mate. So but again, we'd gone. You have to remember, we'd gone 12 years without having a world champion and an individual world champion, and it was such a rare thing. We've been spoiled in these. When I talk to my kids, they're spoiled. They've had Tai Woffinden win 3 times, and they've won a World Cup. That didn't happen. Crikey, this is a rare. I said, make the most. I've said to the kids, watch this. When Andy Murray won Wimbledon a few years ago, I made them watch the television. Said, this is like, make sure you watch this. This is a moment in your life. This isn't going to happen very often that we see someone win. And I've done it obviously Taylor and I were there, but I've watched the other 2 kids go, why you watch this Speedway Nations, because this isn't going to happen very often, sadly. But they're great. Okay, Gary was a very special year, and like, as you say, the interesting thing about the Gary thing was that probably you could argue that had a massive influence on my own career in the end, because if it hadn't been for the following year, we had that photo shoot with Sean Maguire at Arena Essex, doing the pictures with Matthew Wright and all that, I wouldn't have ended up at the Sun. And so that ended up being quite a pivotal moment for me as well. And Gary knows that. Gary knows how, we're still best friends. We don't see each other because we're in different places, but we still talk. And he's not, the great thing about Gary is he's never changed in all that time. He's not. Jason and Gary have never stopped being the same people I met, 25 years ago. This here, this is his last ever Grand Prix. The board he had up in Lonigo in 96 before he broke his back. He broke his back the week later. But this was in the Lonigo, and it was hanging up on the long end. That was I was with him that night, and I nicked this board, And because on the back, because on the other, it was Loran was on the opposite side of the pits, and it was a wall, and they hung them over. So I've got a load of Gary Havelock rubbish knocking about. I've still got that GQ and stuff like that for stuff of his, and we picked up along the way. But Gary, he makes me laugh a lot. Talk about people having no filter. Gary Havelock's got no filter. He was the first person to have no filter ever. So, but I never changes. He never will.
There's something to learn from that as well, though, kids. Okay, so onto the referee then. If you're going to have a dream referee, because referees do play a huge role in how meetings go, but who would you go for?
Best referee I've ever come across is Graham Brodie. Graham Brodie was a very intelligent guy, and you rarely ever, I don't think in my entire career, I ever spoke about the referee in a big meeting when you never said Graham Brodie did this, Graham Brodie did. The best referees in the world are anonymous. And I mean that in the most nice manner. But if you're talking about the referee, it means they've done something wrong or they've got an ego or whatever. But Graham Brodie always ran great meetings, and he went through a period of time in the 80s and 90s where he was doing all the big meetings, the world finals and whatever, and he was just world class. And you never spoke about him. And I remember the great headline there was a great headline in Speedway Star, which I think Phil Rising might have written. He did the 1988 World Final in Voyens, Graham Brodie, and it was I think he may well have been the first ever British referee ever made. And I remember the headline was the prime of Graham Brodie or something. It was like instead of Miss Jean Brodie, it was like sort of great headline. And I've probably got that headline wrong. I've probably remembered it in the wrong way, but I remember vividly that. And but Graham was always a great guy to sit down with as well. Very, very, very sensible guy and very, very good to talk to, and to sort of, again, for me, when I was a younger kid, we used to sit at meetings and not in dinners and stuff with him, and he was always a very, very good influence on me as well.
Fantastic. Graham Brodie then. And to help Graham out, a rule you would change about Speedway. Can of worms.
Oh, right. I hate guests. I hate the guest rule more than about. If I could eliminate somehow the guest rule overnight, I would. I know there's problems with that and blah 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 blah, but I just don't like it. I don't, and it's the one thing. It's the one thing in the media as well. If I say to someone, if Scott Nicholls rode for Bellevue one night and they wound up winning the title or something, say, well, and say, oh, by the way, Scott Nicholls rides for Peterborough, you rode for Bellevue that night, and no one gets that. Media just go, well, what the hell? That's Mickey Mouse. You can't have that. You can't have Wayne Rooney, or you can't have Ronaldo guesting for Man City when he plays for Man United. So they don't get it, and it makes Speedway look stupid, basically, and it has done for a long time. And somehow Speedway needs to find a way of eliminating that if it's going to be taken seriously. I also don't like the start thing at the moment. I just wish they'd say you can move if they're bringing the rider up. You can move a little bit as long as you don't touch the tape. So this pulling back for slightly moving, and that's a pain in the backside. And this Kelvin thing when they go back to the pit gate after the race stop, they just go straight back to the start. So, but anyway, stop me there, because otherwise I will go on.
I'm going to sort of stop you before you descend into a pit of despair or something. You're not the first to mention that, though, about being able to move at the starts and all that kind of thing. I think that seems to be a fairly popular thing that people would tweak if they had the chance. So your next question then is, who would be the opposition for your dream team? A team that has existed at some point in time. Who would be your opposition?
As we said, there's an overlap with my ideal team with the team they would ride against. So I'd obviously had to use guests for the opposition, obviously. So I'm joking.
A team of guests.
I would have to say, if I'm allowed to say, that it's the American Test Match team of 1982 would be my ideal team. That was Penhall, Schwartz, Segalos, the Moran brothers, and Autry. It was just different scale, different class. I mean, I would also, there was other two. The Reading team of 1980 was brilliant, and so was the Cradley team of 1983. They were sensational teams. But if someone said to me tomorrow, you were going to go and watch a meeting again, I think I would probably say I would want to watch one of those Test matches in 81 or 82 with England and USA. Would just I actually had to watch one to remind myself of that team. There was, and It was my dad was commentating on it. It was from 1982 at Swindon, and I'm actually in the background as a little kid when I'm 11 years old with my sister. Would you believe, in one of the interviews, and but that meeting was off the. It's just like Carter and Penhall. Penhall and Carter had two massive rucks on the track, and it was like Segala was what a speedway rider he was.
Well, Eric Bucock, the joint England boss, that's a dramatic start for England, both the riders excluded. How's that going to affect the morale of the side, do you think?
Well, it'll probably make us go a bit harder, David, I would think. It's not a very good start, I must admit, but it's not the end of the world. There's 17 heats left, and we just have to make up for it later on.
And, the Morans as well. I mean, so how England didn't win many Test series, well, I'm not surprised, because that American team was just sensational. And I, as a kid, I actually ended up supporting the Americans. So this is someone who I'm very patriotic, but that team was amazing. So I remember it was so cold at Swindon that night, or that afternoon. It was a bank holiday Monday. They did a World of Sport special with Dickie Davis and they had a handheld camera on the centre green. It was the worst production ever. You couldn't follow anything. But it was so cold on that May bank holiday. I remember I was standing in the pits with my sister, and Bruce Penhall came and gave me his jacket because I was so cold. And Bruce was like saying, "You look perishing there." So I remember. So that was my memory of that meeting more than anything, was that I was wearing Bruce's coat, and it was the best thing ever happened to me in my life at that stage, I think. But Bruce and Bobby were close to my dad. So I was wearing this American Bruce Penhall jacket. That was my claim to fame.
Yeah, that is the definition of living the dream. And that is where we'll leave it for this episode. Thanks very much for joining us, Phil Lanning. It's been great hearing about yours and your family's story. I think that there are many people that you probably have never met that actually feel a real connection to your family, because obviously your dad's voice brought Speedway into so many homes, and great to hear your experiences and your dream team as well. So thanks for joining us on this episode of Humans of Speedway. Thank you very much. No, it's been enjoyable, although I've had to sweat blood over those all-time teams and stuff like that. But hey, that's a morning I'll never get back now. Thanks for that. So, but no, most enjoyable. Thanks for your time. Thanks again to Phil Lanning for joining us on Humans of Speedway. And thanks to you for listening as well. I hope you've enjoyed it. There's plenty more episodes where they came from. Have a look through the back catalogue. But this year alone, in 2021, we've spoken to the likes of Jeremy Doncaster, Chris Morton. We spoke to Dennis McCleary from Berwick Speedway earlier in the year as well. Nikolai Clint. And there's more to come in 2021, even though we're recording this at the very start of December at the moment. So there's more to come before the end of this year and into 2022. We've got some lined up as well. And don't forget to tell your friends and spread the word. And we look forward to speaking with you on the next episode of Humans of Speedway.
Sports Social Podcast Network.
Looking for a fun way to win up to 25 times your money this basketball season? Test your skills on Prize Picks, the most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Just select 2 or more players, pick more or less on their projection for a wide variety of stats, and place your entry. It's as easy as that. If you have the skills, you can turn $10 into $250 with just a few taps. Easy gameplay, quick withdrawals, and injury insurance on your picks are what make Prize Picks the #1 daily fantasy sports app. Ready to test your skills? Join the Prize Picks community of more than 7 million players who have already signed up. Right now, Prize Picks will match your first deposit up to $100. Just visit prizepicks.com/get100 and use code GET100. That's code GET100 at prizepicks.com/get100. for a first deposit matchup to $100. Prize Picks, daily fantasy sports made easy.